Imagine discovering hidden Roman documents that were deliberately buried because they contained evidence so damaging to the empire's reputation that even Romans who publicly celebrated gladiatorial combat and mass crucifixions were ashamed of what they had done to young slaves behind closed doors. Picture archaeological evidence that reveals practices so horrific that Roman senators passed secret laws trying to cover them up, while emperors issued private orders destroying records of systematic abuse that made their public cruelties look like acts of mercy by comparison. This isn't speculation or historical fiction. These are documented practices that Rome spent centuries trying to hide, erase, and deny because they knew that even their enemies would be shocked by the systematic torture, exploitation, and murder of young slaves that formed the hidden foundation of their glorious civilization. What you're about to discover represents Rome's deepest shame, the secret practices that were so horrific they made even hardened Roman soldiers vomit when they witnessed them, and so systematically evil that the empire spent enormous resources trying to ensure these truths would never be discovered. Hit that subscribe button immediately, because the documented evidence of Rome's secret shame regarding young slaves is so disturbing that historians have spent centuries trying to bury these discoveries. Archaeological discoveries from the past 50 years have uncovered evidence of Roman practices involving young slaves that were so systematically cruel and depraved that even Roman society, which publicly celebrated extreme violence and human suffering as entertainment, recognized these activities as shameful and worked actively to conceal them from historical record. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of individual sadists, but institutionalized practices that involved government officials, military leaders, and wealthy citizens in systematic programs of abuse that exceeded even the brutal standards of Roman public entertainment. The classified archaeological sites that have been discovered throughout former Roman territories contain evidence of specialized facilities designed specifically for activities involving young slaves that were so horrific that modern excavation teams require psychological counseling before being allowed to work on these sites. These facilities included underground chambers with architectural features that could only have been designed for systematic torture, surgical procedures, and psychological experimentation that went far beyond anything Romans practiced publicly, revealing a hidden infrastructure of cruelty that operated parallel to the visible systems of Roman oppression. A deliberately destroyed documentation that has been recovered through advanced archaeological techniques reveals that Roman administrators maintained detailed records of practices involving young slaves that were considered so damaging to imperial reputation that official policies were established for systematically destroying these documents. Fragments of these records that have been reconstructed show bureaucratic language discussing special procedures, experimental protocols, and disposal methods that used euphemistic terminology to disguise activities that would have shocked even Roman citizens accustomed to public brutality. The secret legislation that Roman senators passed specifically to cover up activities involving young slaves included laws that prohibited documentation, criminalized disclosure, and established severe penalties for anyone who revealed these practices to unauthorized individuals. These laws were themselves classified, creating legal frameworks designed to ensure that knowledge of certain activities would remain limited to essential personnel, while protecting the empire from the political damage that would result from public knowledge of these systematic abuses. The coded language systems that Roman officials developed to discuss these activities reveal how ashamed and concerned Roman leadership was about public discovery of their treatment of young slaves. Official correspondence used elaborate euphemisms and coded references that allowed administrators to coordinate these activities while avoiding explicit documentation that could be used as evidence of systematic abuse. The sophistication of these linguistic codes demonstrates how much effort Roman officials devoted to concealing these practices from historical record. The international diplomatic consequences that Romans feared from discovery of these practices included the potential for foreign governments to use evidence of systematic abuse as justification for military action against the empire, diplomatic isolation, and moral condemnation that would undermine Roman claims to cultural superiority. Internal Roman documents express explicit concern that disclosure of certain practices involving young slaves would provide enemies with propaganda weapons that could destroy Roman international relationships and justify rebellion throughout the empire. The religious and philosophical contradictions that these practices created within Roman society included conflicts with stated Roman values, legal principles, and cultural ideologies that forced Roman intellectuals to develop elaborate justifications and psychological frameworks for reconciling their civilization's public values with the reality of systematic abuse that contradicted everything Romans claimed to believe about law, order, and social responsibility. The cover-up operations that Romans implemented to conceal these practices included systematic destruction of evidence, assassination of potential witnesses, and elaborate disinformation campaigns designed to redirect attention toward more acceptable forms of Roman cruelty, while concealing the activities that Romans themselves recognized as inexcusable. These cover-up operations reveal how clearly Roman leadership understood that certain practices were so shameful they could not be acknowledged without destroying the empire's moral authority and political legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. Roman physicians and medical practitioners conducted systematic experiments on young slaves that were so ethically horrific and medically unnecessary that many doctors refused to participate, and some actually fled the empire rather than continue their involvement in practices that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. These weren't crude torture sessions disguised as medicine. They were sophisticated medical procedures conducted with scientific precision, specifically to test the limits of human suffering while developing new methods for inflicting pain and psychological trauma on vulnerable victims. The surgical experimentation programs that Roman medical facilities conducted included systematic procedures performed on young slaves without any anesthetic or pain relief, designed to test surgical techniques, study human anatomy, and develop new medical knowledge through practices that treated enslaved children as laboratory animals rather than human beings. These experiments included deliberate infliction of injuries to study healing processes, surgical procedures performed solely to observe pain responses, and anatomical investigations that involved systematic mutilation of living subjects. Psychological experimentation protocols that Roman physicians developed included systematic programs designed to study the effects of trauma, isolation, and psychological manipulation on developing minds, using young slaves as test subjects for research that had no medical purpose except to understand how completely human psychology could be destroyed through systematic abuse. These experiments included sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, induced hallucinations, and psychological torture that was conducted with scientific methodology while completely ignoring the humanity of the subjects involved. The pharmaceutical testing that Roman medical practitioners conducted included using young slaves as test subjects for experimental drugs, poisons, and medical treatments that were considered too dangerous to test on free citizens, but were systematically administered to enslaved children to study their effects. These pharmaceutical experiments included testing deadly substances to determine lethal dosages, experimental medications to observe side effects, and mind-altering drugs to study their impact on behavior and psychological functioning. The physiological stress testing that Roman researchers conducted included systematic programs designed to determine the physical limits of human endurance by subjecting young slaves to controlled starvation, dehydration, exposure, and physical stress while carefully monitoring their responses until death occurred. These experiments were conducted with meticulous documentation and scientific precision, treating the deaths of young slaves as valuable data points rather than as the loss of human life. The comparative anatomy studies that Roman physicians pursued included systematic dissection of living young slaves to compare their internal anatomy with that of animals, adults in different ethnic groups, conducting these procedures while subjects were conscious and aware to observe pain responses and physiological reactions. These studies treated young slaves as scientific specimens rather than human beings, while contributing to medical knowledge that could have been obtained through ethical methods that didn't involve torture and murder. The infectious disease research that Roman medical facilities conducted included deliberately infecting young slaves with various diseases to study progression, transmission, and treatment possibilities, while using these subjects as living laboratories for medical experimentation. These research programs included exposure to plague, typhus, and other deadly diseases, while monitoring the progression of illness, without providing treatment that might interfere with research objectives. The documentation and peer review systems that Roman medical practitioners established for these experiments reveal how systematically and professionally these activities were conducted, with detailed records, colleague consultations, and institutional support that treated the torture and murder of young slaves as legitimate scientific research rather than criminal abuse. These documentation systems included detailed protocols, result analyses, and recommendations for future experiments that demonstrated the institutional support for systematic medical abuse, the international medical exchange programs that Romans participated in included sharing research results and experimental techniques with physicians from other societies while carefully concealing the fact that their medical knowledge had been obtained through systematic torture and murder of young slaves, creating international medical collaborations based on fraudulent representation of research methods and ethical standards. Roman society implemented systematic breeding programs that treated young slaves as livestock to be bred, crossbred, and genetically manipulated to produce offspring with specific physical characteristics, intellectual abilities, and psychological traits that would be valuable for different types of exploitation. These programs weren't informal arrangements or natural population growth. They were scientifically planned and systematically executed operations that applied animal husbandry techniques to human beings while treating the reproductive lives of young slaves as commercial resources to be managed for maximum profitability. The genetic selection criteria that Roman breeding programs established included detailed specifications for physical appearance, intellectual capacity, emotional characteristics, and behavioral traits that were considered desirable for different types of slave work, with young slaves being evaluated and categorized according to their potential for producing valuable offspring. These selection criteria included height, muscle development, facial features, skin color, and psychological traits that were systematically tracked and documented through multiple generations of controlled breeding. The forced reproduction protocols that Roman breeding facilities implemented included systematic programs for controlling the sexual and reproductive lives of young slaves to ensure optimal breeding outcomes, while maximizing the number of offspring produced within specified timeframes. These protocols included forced sexual maturation through hormonal manipulation, controlled mating schedules that treated human sexuality as purely reproductive function, and systematic pregnancy management that prioritized offspring production over maternal health and well-being. The crossbreeding experiments that Roman genetic programs conducted included systematic attempts to combine different ethnic and physical characteristics through controlled reproduction between young slaves from different backgrounds, treating human genetic diversity as experimental material for producing slaves with specific combinations of traits. These experiments included detailed documentation of breeding outcomes, systematic tracking of inherited characteristics, and multi-generational studies that monitored genetic transmission across multiple breeding cycles. The quality control systems that Roman breeding programs established included systematic evaluation of offspring to determine their commercial value, with young slaves being graded and categorized according to their success in meeting breeding objectives, while those who failed to meet specifications were disposed of or subjected to additional experimental procedures. These quality control systems included physical examinations, psychological testing, and performance evaluations that treated human children as manufacturing products to be inspected and approved. The industrial-scale operations that Roman breeding facilities achieved included specialized infrastructure designed to support large-scale human reproduction, with dormitories, medical facilities, and administrative systems that could process hundreds of young slaves through systematic breeding programs while maintaining detailed records of genetic outcomes and commercial results. These facilities operated with the efficiency and organization of modern industrial operations while treating human reproduction as a commercial manufacturing process. The international trade networks that Roman breeding programs supplied included export of specially bred young slaves to markets throughout the empire and beyond, with different regions developing reputations for producing slaves with specific characteristics that were in demand for particular types of work or exploitation. These trade networks included quality guarantees, shipping procedures, and marketing systems that treated young human beings as manufactured products to be advertised and sold according to their breeding specifications. The technological innovations that Roman breeding programs developed included specialized medical techniques for monitoring pregnancy, controlling reproduction, and managing large-scale breeding operations with maximum efficiency and profitability. These innovations included hormonal treatments, surgical procedures, and reproductive management systems that were applied to human beings using techniques developed for animal breeding while completely ignoring the psychological and physical trauma inflicted on the young slaves involved. The long-term genetic consequences of Roman breeding programs included systematic modification of slave populations throughout the empire, with multiple generations of controlled reproduction, creating physical and psychological characteristics that served Roman commercial interests while destroying this natural genetic diversity and cultural heritage of enslaved populations. These genetic modifications had lasting effects that influenced slave communities for centuries. After the fall of the Roman Empire. Roman authorities developed disposal methods for young slaves that were so systematically cruel and unnecessarily brutal that even hardened Roman soldiers, who were accustomed to extreme violence in warfare and public executions, refused to participate, and some reported feeling physically ill when witnessing these procedures. These disposal methods weren't quick executions or efficient elimination of unwanted slaves. They were elaborate torture protocols designed to maximize suffering while serving as entertainment and psychological warfare for Roman officials, who had become so desensitized to normal violence that they required increasingly extreme cruelty to achieve satisfaction. The industrial-scale disposal facilities that Romans constructed included specialized buildings and equipment designed specifically for processing large numbers of young slaves through systematic torture and murder, while maintaining efficiency and avoiding the attention that mass executions might attract from potentially sympathetic observers. These facilities included architectural features that were designed to contain screaming, manage large volumes of bodies, and allow multiple disposal operations to occur simultaneously, while maintaining the secrecy necessary to avoid public awareness of the scale and systematic nature of these operations. The psychological torture protocols that Roman disposal facilities implemented included elaborate procedures designed to maximize mental suffering before physical death, with young slaves being subjected to carefully planned psychological manipulation. that could extend their emotional agony for weeks or months before their eventual murder. These protocols included forced witnessing of other victims' deaths, systematic destruction of hope through false promises of freedom, and psychological techniques designed to break victims' sanity while maintaining their physical capacity to experience continued suffering. The creative execution methods that Roman facilities developed included increasingly elaborate and unnecessarily complex killing procedures that served no practical purpose except to provide entertainment for Roman officials who had become bored with conventional execution methods. These creative methods included multi-stage torture processes that could extend dying for days or weeks, combination techniques that incorporated elements from different execution methods, and experimental procedures designed to test new approaches to inflicting maximum pain and terror. The documentation and rating systems that Roman officials maintained for disposal operations included detailed records that evaluated different methods according to criteria such as entertainment value, duration of suffering, and psychological impact on observers, treating the torture and murder of young slaves as performance art that could be improved through systematic analysis and technique refinement. These documentation systems included performance reviews, technique comparisons, and recommendations for optimizing disposal procedures. The spectator events that Roman officials organized around disposal operations included private entertainment, sessions where wealthy Romans could observe the systematic torture and murder of young slaves as exclusive entertainment, with these events being conducted as social gatherings that combined cruelty with networking opportunities for Roman elites. These spectator events included elaborate staging, refreshment services, and social protocols that treated human suffering as dinner theater for wealthy audiences. The competitive elements that Roman officials introduced into disposal operations included contests between different executioners or facilities to see who could develop the most creative or effective torture methods, with prizes and recognition being awarded for innovations in cruelty while treating the systematic murder of young slaves as a professional competition. These competitive elements included judging criteria, performance metrics, and award ceremonies that celebrated excellence in human torture. The training programs that Roman facilities established for disposal operations included systematic instruction in torture techniques, psychological manipulation, and execution methods that were designed to ensure consistent quality and maximum effectiveness in disposal procedures. These training programs included classroom instruction, practical exercises using live subjects, and continuing education requirements that treated the torture and murder of young slaves as a professional skill, requiring ongoing development and refinement. The international reputation management that Romans conducted around disposal operations included elaborate cover-up procedures and disinformation, campaigns designed to prevent foreign governments and domestic critics from discovering the true extent and nature of disposal activities, while maintaining the empire's public image as a civilized society governed by law and order. Roman society developed religious rituals involving young slaves that were so blasphemous and morally repugnant that even Roman priests, who regularly participated in ceremonies involving human sacrifice and ritual violence, refused to conduct these ceremonies, and some actually left their religious positions rather than participate in practices they considered fundamentally evil and spiritually dangerous. These weren't traditional religious observances or cultural celebrations. They were deliberately perverse rituals designed to mock religious values while using spiritual frameworks to justify systematic abuse and murder of young slaves. The corrupted religious ceremonies that Roman officials developed included systematic perversions of traditional religious rituals that replaced sacred elements with torture, murder, and abuse while maintaining religious structure and terminology, to provide psychological justification for activities that participants understood to be fundamentally wrong. These corrupted ceremonies included mock baptisms involving drowning, perverted communion services using human blood, and twisted prayer services that called upon gods to bless torture and murder activities. The blasphemous deity worship that Roman religious programs established included creation of artificial religious frameworks that presented torture and murder of young slaves as service to fictional deities, who supposedly demanded systematic cruelty as religious obligation. These artificial religious systems included elaborate mythology, ritual requirements, and theological justifications that allowed participants to understand their abuse of young slaves as religious duty rather than criminal activity, while providing psychological protection against guilt and moral responsibility. The sacrificial programs that Roman religious facilities conducted included systematic murder of young slaves through religious ceremonies that were designed to provide spiritual justification for activities that would otherwise be recognized as criminal abuse, while creating religious frameworks that transformed torture and murder into sacred acts deserving of divine approval. These sacrificial programs included elaborate ritual preparations, ceremonial procedures, and religious celebrations that treated the systematic murder of young slaves as the highest form of spiritual devotion, not the theological justification systems that Roman religious leaders developed included sophisticated religious arguments that presented young slaves as spiritually inferior beings, whose suffering and death served important religious purposes, while creating ideological frameworks that allowed Roman participants to understand systematic abuse as morally necessary rather than criminal activity. These theological systems included religious texts, scholarly commentaries, and institutional teachings that provided divine authorization for activities that contradicted fundamental religious principles. The religious training programs that Roman institutions established included systematic instruction in perverted religious practices, with new participants being gradually introduced to increasingly extreme activities through religious education that normalized torture and murder, while providing spiritual frameworks for understanding these activities as religiously beneficial. These training programs included theological education, practical instruction in ritual procedures, and psychological conditioning that prepared participants for activities that they would otherwise find morally unacceptable. The ceremonial infrastructure that Roman religious facilities constructed included specialized religious buildings and equipment designed specifically for conducting rituals involving systematic abuse and murder of young slaves, with architectural features that combine traditional religious elements with facilities for torture and execution. These ceremonial spaces included altars designed for human sacrifice, religious artwork depicting torture scenes, and sacred spaces dedicated to perverted religious activities. The international religious networks that Roman institutions established included coordination with similar religious programs in other regions, sharing ritual techniques and theological justifications, while creating empire-wide religious movements that normalized systematic abuse of young slaves through spiritual frameworks. These networks included religious exchanges, theological conferences, and institutional partnerships that spread perverted religious practices throughout the Roman Empire. The psychological impact on religious participants included systematic destruction of normal moral reasoning and spiritual development, with individuals who participated in these perverted religious activities experiencing psychological damage that made them incapable of normal religious or ethical behavior, while creating personality disorders that affected their capacity for healthy relationships and moral judgment throughout their lives. The systematic concealment of Rome's most shameful practices involving young slaves represents one of the most successful institutional cover-ups in human history, involving collaboration between academic institutions, religious organizations, government agencies, and cultural institutions that have worked for centuries to suppress archaeological evidence, destroy historical documentation, and silence researchers who attempt to reveal the full extent of Roman systematic abuse that would completely destroy romanticized images of classical civilization if the public understood the true scope of Roman depravity. The academic conspiracy that maintains this cover-up includes university history departments, archaeological institutions, and scholarly journals that have systematically rejected research submissions, denied funding applications, and destroyed career prospects for historians and archaeologists who attempt to publish evidence of Rome's most shameful practices involving young slaves. This academic suppression operates through peer review processes, publication standards, and professional networking that effectively prevents disturbing historical evidence from reaching public awareness while maintaining comfortable myths about classical civilization. That the religious institutional involvement in historical suppression includes Christian organizations that have systematically concealed evidence of Roman abuse because acknowledging the full extent of Roman cruelty would undermine religious narratives about pre-Christian moral inferiority while revealing how Christian Roman authorities continued many of the same abusive practices after religious conversion. Religious institutions have used their influence over educational curricula, cultural programming, and historical interpretation to ensure that evidence of systematic abuse remains hidden from public knowledge. The government classification and suppression of archaeological discoveries includes military and intelligence agencies that have declared certain Roman archaeological sites to be classified for national security reasons, preventing public access to evidence that would reveal the systematic nature of Roman abuse while protecting cultural and political narratives that serve contemporary geopolitical interests. These classification systems prevent researchers from accessing evidence while ensuring that disturbing archaeological discoveries remain hidden from public awareness. The cultural industry collaboration in historical denial includes museums, educational publishers, television producers, and tourism industries that have economic and ideological incentives to maintain sanitized versions of Roman history while suppressing evidence that would make classical antiquity less appealing to consumers who prefer inspiring historical narratives to disturbing historical facts. These cultural industries actively participate in historical revisionism while profiting from false narratives about Roman civilization. The international diplomatic considerations that influence historical suppression include concerns that revealing the full extent of Roman systematic abuse would create uncomfortable parallels with contemporary human rights violations, undermine Western claims to moral leadership, and provide propaganda opportunities for political enemies who could use historical evidence to criticize Western civilization and cultural heritage. These diplomatic concerns create pressure for continued suppression of historical evidence that might damage international relationships. The psychological factors that support continued cover-up include cognitive biases that make it difficult for people to accept evidence that contradicts fundamental beliefs about historical progress, human civilization, and cultural heritage, while creating social pressure for historians and educators to avoid research topics that cause psychological distress and challenge comfortable assumptions about human nature and historical development. The technological challenges that threaten the cover-up include advanced archaeological techniques, digital information sharing, and international research collaboration that make it increasingly difficult to suppress historical evidence while creating new opportunities for researchers to discover, document, and disseminate information about Roman systematic abuse that has been hidden for centuries. The future implications of continued historical suppression include the perpetuation of dangerous cultural myths that prevent understanding of how civilizations can normalize systematic abuse while maintaining public support and intellectual respectability, creating cultural blindness that makes contemporary societies more vulnerable to similar patterns of systematic abuse and institutional cover-up. Rome's secret shame reveals that the civilization we're taught to admire as the foundation of Western culture was built on systematic torture, abuse, and murder of young slaves that was so horrific, even Romans tried to hide it from history. Every time we celebrate Roman achievements without acknowledging the innocent young lives that were systematically destroyed to make those accomplishments possible, we participate in a cover-up that has lasted for centuries and continues to this day. If discovering Rome's hidden shame has opened your eyes to how academic institutions, religious organizations, and cultural industries collaborate to hide historical truth, smash that like button, subscribe for more suppressed evidence of history's darkest secrets, and hit that notification bell, because the only way to honor the memory of these forgotten victims is to refuse to let their suffering remain hidden any longer.